Welcome to this last class of the Grundrisse series, and happy Cinco de Mayo. And it also happens to be Karl Marx's birthday, who would be 202 years old today. And we're still trying to figure out what he really meant with all the stuff that he wrote when he was 40 years old. Now, the Grundrisse, as you obviously know by now, is a text which is a bit all over the place. And as somebody kind of commented in the papers that I received or comments I received, it's full of jewel-like insights, sometimes buried in quite a bit of conceptual mud. It takes a little hard work to dig it out. I think there's absolutely no way you could say that there's a single definitive interpretation of this text. And I think it's a sort of a huge kind of inventory of different ideas and possibilities, pointing in very often quite contradictory and sometimes antagonistic directions. The contradictions shouldn't bother us because Marx is very fond of them and likes to generate them. Even when the case for them being there is not very strong, he'll find them. And some of them are striking in their insights, and I think that that's the sort of thing that we will want to get out of it. Now, I had asked people over the last few weeks to sort of send me some commentaries, and I've got a whole sheaf of commentaries here. I can't answer all of them individually, but there are a number of themes which are common to the commentaries, which I think I want to take up. But I also want to make my own commentary because this happens with Marx's texts, that whenever I teach a text, I find some different angle and some different way of thinking about it. And that in some ways is a testimony to the richness of Marx's imagination. And so I don't know how many times I've taught the Grundrisse. Certainly it'd be more than a dozen times over the last 40 or 50 years. But each time I would maybe come out with something that's rather different, and I think I've come up with some particular angles on it this time that I hadn't emphasized before. I'd seen them but not emphasized them, but now I think I would want to emphasize them. So I want to, if you like, write my own final paper to this course with trying to pull together some of the threads that strike me as significant and important about the text as a whole. Now, from the very beginning, I was emphasizing that the background to this text is a concept of the totality. And I want to go back and start again, as it were, with the concept of the totality, because it informs a lot of what it is that I would want to say about what is going on here. And there are three particular passages I would draw your attention to. One is in the introduction, which is in a way Marx addressing the formal structures of classical political economy that dwell on the theme of production, consumption, distribution, exchange. But they approach it in a kind of almost a Newtonian way of disaggregating the elements into specific forces, which then collide and create all kinds of shifts. But in that collision, there are some elements which are stronger than others, and of course, production tends to dominate, but Marx kind of says, well, yes, but, and then does all kinds of things. But he's measuring, in a sense, that whole classical political economic structure of thought against the background of this idea of a totality. On page 99, he reaches his conclusion, which is that it is not that production, distribution, exchange, and consumption are identical, but that they all form the members of a totality, distinctions within a unity. Production predominates not only over itself in the antithetical definition of production, and by that Marx is referring to the fact that production is about two things. One is about the material production of a commodity, but it's also about the production of value. So that the question is, well, what are we looking at? We're looking at the physical process, or we're looking at value, which is the non-physical but social relation part of the process. So production predominates not only over itself in the antithetical definition of production, but over the other moments as well. The process always returns to production to begin anew. That exchange and consumption cannot be predominant is self-evident. Likewise, distribution is distribution of products, while as distribution of the agents of production, it is itself a moment of production. A definite production thus determines a definite consumption, distribution, and exchange, as well as definite relations between these different moments. Admittedly, however, in its one-sided form, production is itself determined by the other moments. For example, if the market, i.e. the sphere of exchange, expands, then production grows in quantity, and the divisions between its different branches become deeper. A change in distribution changes production, e.g. concentration of capital, different distribution of the population between town and country, etc. Finally, the needs of consumption determine production. Mutual interaction takes place between the different moments. This is the case with every organic whole. So Marx is here spelling out the organic whole. Now, this organic whole is something that Marx is conceptually building, but his historical materialist method says that you just don't build it out of ideas, and you just don't build it out of, thinking. You build it by a study of the actual processes which bring that totality into being. So we don't start with the idea that there is a totality and we go out there and we discover it. What we do is start with the idea that a totality has emerged through certain particular processes, and we have to look at those historical materialist processes in order to understand how the totality comes to be, and not only that, but what some of the qualities of this totality are about. And this is, I think, very well put out if you go to pages 196 to 7, where Marx starts to sort of talk more about how this whole kind of totality of capital began to form. And he writes this at the bottom 196, and this is somewhat a longish quote, but I think you need to listen to it and study it carefully. Circulation, he says, is the movement in which the general alienation appears as general appropriation and general appropriation as general alienation. We'll leave that to the side for the moment. As much then as the whole of this movement appears as a social process, and as much as the individual moments of this movement arise from the conscious will and particular purposes of individuals, so much does the totality of the process appear as an objective interrelation which arises spontaneously from nature. Arising, it is true, from a mutual influence of conscious individuals on one another, but neither located in their consciousness nor subsumed under them as a whole. Their own collisions, that is the collisions of all the individuals engaging on these practices, their own collisions with one another, produce an alien social power standing above them, produce their mutual interaction as a process and a power independent of them. Circulation, because a totality of the social process, is also the first form in which the social relation appears as something independent of the individuals, but not only as, say, in a coin or in exchange value, but extending to the whole of the social movement itself. The social relation of individuals to one another as a power over the individuals which has become autonomous, whether conceived as a natural force, as chance, or in whatever other form, is a necessary result of the fact that the point of departure is not the free social individual. Circulation, as the first totality among the economic categories, is well suited to bring this to light. So here is Marx saying that the circulation process, which goes on in markets and through production and all the rest of it, that process is something which is constructed out of the interactions between many, many individuals coming together and often colliding in the end to produce a totality which no one of those individuals can control. And no one of those individuals consciously decided to construct. In other words, this is a social construct that arises out of individual behaviors, but it's a social construct that nobody necessarily had in mind as they engaged in those behaviors. And Marx is spelling this out and then saying that so the circulation of capital, which we're looking at, is a process which is constructed by this history. And this history is, of course, the history of the emergence of market exchange, monetization, and all the rest of it, which you end up studying in here. But you see what Marx is saying about the totality in this case, that the totality has been formed historically, and the totality has qualities, and in particular value theory and all of that, which are very particular qualities, which have been constructed without anybody's being in charge. This is actually a little like, in some ways, what Adam Smith does when he talks about the hidden hand of the market. That the hidden hand of the market emerges out of market processes, and the hidden hand guides, as it were, but Marx is kind of saying it doesn't necessarily guide in a benevolent way, as Smith proposed. So this is the second passage where the notion of the totality is set out. The third passage is on page 278. Where Marx again talks about this totality, but talks about it from this standpoint of the history. He says, while in the completed bourgeois system, every economic relation presupposes every other in its bourgeois economic form, and everything posited is thus also a presupposition. This is the case with every organic system. This organic system itself, as a totality, has its presuppositions, and its development to its totality. Notice Marx is talking about the development of this totality. The development of its totality consists precisely in subordinating all elements of society to itself, or in creating out of it the organs which it still lacks. This is historically how it becomes a totality. The process of becoming this totality forms a moment of its process, of its development. And then Marx goes on to talk about the territoriality of this, that this construction of a totality is likely to be territorially bounded. As it expands, so it's likely to invade other territories, and so he talks a bit about what I call the spatial fix. But what you see here is that there's a totality is in formation, and it has formed. And part of the history that goes on in the Grundrisse is an attempt to familiarize us with the processes by which this totality is set up. Now, how do we represent this totality, and what are its qualities? Well, one of the things that I started out the class with was this diagram, which you have all at some point or other seen, and I gave you all a copy of it. But the point about this diagram is that this is the circulation process that Marx talks about when he kind of says circulation is the first form where we can identify the nature of this totality. And this totality has these different moments within it, that it is a totality of circulation which is going on, but there are distinctive moments within the totality, and the moments are tied together by particular interactions. And the first moment is the money capital, which is taking of money and converting some of the money which exists in society into capital, which is money being used to make more money. And it's going to make more money by a very specific trajectory. And its trajectory is to take the money into the marketplace and to buy commodities in the market. And the commodities are of two types. One is means of production, and the other is labor power. And means of production and labor power are then brought together in a production process. And the production process produces commodities, but also produces value which is going to relate to the value which existed in monetary form at the very base of this. So this is, if you like, the first major step, is the step of production, where labor is going to produce value at the same time as it's going to produce value congealed in very specific commodities. And those commodities are then taken into the marketplace and they're realized in monetary form by a sale. So this sale point becomes very, very important, and I'll come back to it in a minute. Once the value is monetized, and we then have this question: why would you start out with a certain amount of money and end up with the same amount of money at the end of this? Marx's answer to that is nobody's going to do it for that reason. They're going to do it so they can get more money. So somehow or other, more money has to end up in this realization moment than existed at the inception moment of money capital. And that more money is arising out of the fact that during this production process, surplus value was created. That is, more value was created than went in. And that more value being created is what labor contributes to this process. So that the realization of value is going to realize not only the original value and replicate that, but it's also going to realize a surplus value in monetary form. And that surplus value in monetary form is what we refer to as profit. So the profit incentive joins this point of the circuit with that. Once everything is monetized, then the money is distributed across various people, various groups in the society who have claims upon it. One of the claims is, of course, the laborers who will claim wages. So we will find wages being claimed out of it. Some of it will be taken by the state as taxes. Some of it will go as profit to the industrialist, the person who's engaged in this process of production. Some of it will go to the merchant, because merchants are very often deployed in helping to sell the commodities, that is, taking the commodity from the point of production into the market and selling it. Some of it will go as rent, because all of this is taking place against the background of land ownership, and that therefore landowners are going to claim a piece of the surplus by virtue of saying, you use my land, you go across my land, you're going to have to pay, in effect, a tax called rent in order to get access to that land. And some of it will be paid as interest to financiers. So the money here will be distributed. Then part of that distribution ends up being, if you like, the demand for goods, and part of it comes back in terms of reinvestment. And this is the circuit of capital, and this is the circulation process. This is the totality that Marx is describing. And there are certain elements in this totality that are, I think, important to look at. To begin with, there is the question of, well, how do we understand the productivity of this whole kind of system? Now, it is the case in any totality that there's going to be different moments in it of this sort. So we have here the moment of production, the moment of realization, the moment of distribution, and the moment of reinvestment. So that these are key moments in this kind of process. And we then can start to talk about it as later on by saying, well, because you're getting more at this point at the top and the realization, this is not really a circle, it's really a spiral. Now, when we look at this process, there are a number of things that can be said about it. Of course, this is a highly simplified version of what Marx is talking about, but nevertheless, it tells you, I think, rather a lot. about what he is doing in the Grundrisse, because he's looking at very different aspects of this system in the Grundrisse. Now, for me, there are a couple of issues which crop up immediately, and a couple of people in writing kind of commentaries mentioned the fact that I'm often depicted as somebody who thinks that value can arise in circulation against those like Michael Roberts and so on, who insist that the only place where value can be created is in production. Now, I like Michael Roberts very much. He has a wonderful blog. You should check it out. It's full of information and the like. But Michael has this kind of view that the key point in this whole circulation process is production. And in the same way that Marx, in his depiction of the totality, kind of says production dominates, but then he turns around and says, well, but actually distribution also plays a role and everything else comes back. So when in a totality, everything relates to everything else. So it's very difficult to say that somehow or other only one aspect of this process works. My point is very much this, and and of course it was spelled out in Marx's initial description, which is to say, yes, I always take the position, and I can actually, let me read some quotations to you from different pages where Marx deals with this whole kind of question of what is the relationship within this totality between production and realization. And Marx, in some ways, has signaled what the relation is going to be early on, when in that first thing that I read to you, when he says, a definite production thus determines a definite consumption, distribution, and exchange, as well as definite relations between these different moments. Admittedly, however, in its one-sided form, production is itself determined by the other moments. For example, if the market, i.e. the sphere of exchange, expands, then production grows in quantity and the divisions between its different branches become deeper. A change in distribution changes production. So Marx does not actually say in this conception of the totality that nothing that goes on here at the point of realization is relevant. In fact, there's a lot that is extremely relevant. And what Marx does in the Grundrisse is spend quite a bit of time talking about what he calls the contradictory unity of production and realization. And on page 543, he summarizes this argument very crisply in the following way, when he says, the circulation of capital realizes value, while living labor creates value. Now, what's more important, the creation of value or the realization of value? Marx kind of answers, well, if you can't realize the value, it's no value. So actually, they're co-dependent upon each other. And there actually exists in a situation, as he says, of contradictory unity. He says, this is page 415, the contradiction between production and realization, of which capital by its concept is the unity, has to be grasped. That is, okay, so there's a contradictory unity between production and realization. And that contradictory unity exists because that is how they exist within the totality of this circulation process, which we're looking at. And if I go back to page 4047, he says this, in the production process itself, where capital continued to be presupposed as value, its realization appeared totally dependent on the relation of capital to wage labor. Okay, so within that production process, it's the relationship to wage labor which is critical. That's where value is going to be produced. But now, he says, as a product, as a commodity, it appears dependent upon circulation, which lies outside this labor process, that is, the realization moment. As a commodity, it must be, one, a use value, and as such, an object of need, object of consumption. it must be exchanged for its equivalent in money. The new value can be realized only through sale. Thus, he says, by emerging from the production process and re-entering circulation, capital A appears to encounter a barrier in the available magnitude of consumption capacity. So my argument has always been that, yes, all value is created in production, but if it cannot be realized, it is not value. And Marx says that here very clearly. He also says it in volume 1 of Capital. So if there is a barrier in realization, if commodities have been produced which don't meet a human need, which nobody wants or nobody can afford, then it's not value. But that's the point of the totality. The totality has to operate in such a way that whatever it is that is the flow, that moving in this circulatory process, whatever's there is going to be sustained, and it must go through each one of these moments. And it must go through the moment of money, it must go through the buying and buying of commodities, it must go through the moment of production, it must go through the moment of realization, and it must go through the moment of distribution, it must go through the moment of reinvestment and come back in. But if it can't get through any of those moments, then the system is screwed. So this is, it seems to me, what the point of the totality. So when Michael Roberts kind of says, I actually place more emphasis upon the moment of realization and consumption, the answer is yes, I do, because I think there are serious barriers there, which is why in this diagram I put up here near realization the whole kind of question of wants, needs, and desires, and how capital manages wants, needs, and desires. And this is historically very important. And if it can't manage wants, needs, and desires adequately, then there's going to be a blockage at the point of realization. And it's not only management of wants, needs, and desires, but there has to be effective demand, that is, wants, needs, and desires backed by ability to pay. Now, if there is a blockage at the point of realization because there's not enough money to pay and there's no want, need, and desire, then the release of that blockage will actually then release production, which was going to be dead value because there was no market for it, and it's going to animate that and reanimate it so that the value which is created there can be realized. So it is that relationship between production and realization which is critical to me. Now, in volume 1 of Capital, what Marx did was to say, okay, I'm going to write an analysis of how capital works under certain assumptions. And one of the assumptions was that there would be absolutely no problem of selling the product. All commodities, he said, trade at their value. All commodities can go to market and there's no blockage in realization. So his analysis in volume 1 of Capital discounts entirely the whole kind of question of realization. Similarly, what he does in volume 1 of Capital is to discount the idea that what happens in the field of distribution has anything to do with what happens. So he says, basically, I think everything that goes on in the field of distribution works out fine. There's no need to go into it. I'm simply going to look at this first part of the circulation process, which in effect takes you from the initial money up to the profit. So this is a key point. But my argument would be that it's okay to do that as an assumption, but that's not a realistic economy. A realistic economy is a lot of time having to deal with the kind of question of the organization of consumption, organization and orchestration of consumption capacity. And if you can't do that, you get devaluation and you get loss of value. So I'm perfectly happy, and I never ever say that value can be created through the activities of market exchange. I never say that. Yeah, value is always created in production, but creation is not the only thing you have to think about. You also have to think about realization. You also have to think about distribution and how the distribution works. And that is not the topic that Marx deals with in volume 1 of Capital. Those are topics he deals with in volume 2 to some degree and volume 3 of Capital, but then you get a different story coming out. So this is, if you like, one of the features. of this circulation process, which I think is very important. And Marx takes up this whole kind of question of relationship between production and realization, and is being very explicit about how we should be thinking of that. Now, there are many other aspects in the Grundrisse of this sort which Marx takes up, which sometimes in a rather shallow way, but I think in an important way. You will notice if you look at this diagram that there's something over here called social reproduction, which is about the reproduction of labor power. And the reproduction of labor power is obviously a very important moment. And it actually has its own circulation process. And Marx calls this on page 673 to 78. He calls this the small circulation. I don't know why he calls it small, but that's what he calls it. And the small circulation is the laborer going from their place of residence to the workplace. They get to the workplace, and what do? They go into the workplace and they offer up their labor power, which the capitalist uses for a day. And at the end of the day, the worker gets a wage, and the wage then is given to the worker. And the workers then take that wage and come back into here and use that wage to buy commodities, which they take back to the place of residence, and they cook them and live with them and all the rest of it. So there is a circulation process here, which is a sort of mini circulation process within this macro system. And that mini circulation process is distinctive, and it has distinctive qualities. And I suddenly kind of started to think about this. Actually, the whole structure of the Grundrisse, in some ways, is a detailed investigation and essay on different circulatory structures within this totality. In other words, this totality, I've done this map of it, and I'm very happy with it, and I hope you are too, because it does help signify some of what's happening. But there's a lot of things that go on which are way beyond this. To begin with, I've mentioned that this is not in practice a circulation process. It's a spiral process, and therefore it's constantly growing with all kinds of consequences, which I'm not going to get into here, but we've been talking about that very, very frequently. So this is an important one important aspect. It's a spiral. But then it turns out that there are many different mini circulation processes within this totality. And they are all interrelated with each other, but sometimes antagonistic to each other. And I think that it's therefore important to unpack what they're about. Now, here I'm going to use an analogy which is dangerous, because when you take this analogy and you really take it very far, you take it to its ultimate end, you get some profoundly misleading ideas. But as a starting point, it's a very useful analogy. How many systems exist inside of a human body? Well, okay, you have the circulation of the blood, right? And the heart is critical for the circulation of the blood. You have the input of oxygen as part of the fuel system, and lungs are very important, okay? You have a digestive tract, and you have stomachs, and you have kidneys, and you have liver, and you have circulatory systems of that sort. You have a neural system, which is sending messages all over the place and coordinating things. So a human body then has many different systems. And those different systems actually have very specific and different qualities. And so within medicine, you get these specialities. You have a urologist, and you have a cardiologist, and a pulmonary specialist, and all the rest of it. So you've got these different circulatory systems inside of the human body. And the human body depends upon all of those systems working in a way which is consistent and coordinated with each other. And it's not as if the heart dictates to the lungs or anything of that kind. No, the heart has to do its business, and if the heart stops, you're dead. But also, if the lungs stop, you're dead. And also, if your liver stops, you're dead. And if your brain stops, you're dead. So so you can't say that somehow or other one element here is more important than all of the others. And I feel about this system that we're looking at here, that I feel the same thing about it. I think all of these elements, which can be defined here, moments of distribution, moments of realization, all the rest of it, they all have a meaning. Now, one of the problems I have here is because this automatically will mean that the nature of a crisis is very, very, very significant. But where does the crisis located? Well, you know, if you go into a hospital and you've got a pain in the stomach and somebody says, well, you know, it's really a problem with your heart, and they start messing around with your heart, that's not going to really do you much good. And I feel that with a lot of Marxist analysis of crises, that people have there's only one idea about crisis, which is the falling rate of profit, or something like that. And there are other versions. The falling rate of profit is it, and everything is dependent upon the falling rate of profit. So you have a crisis like in 2007, 2008 in housing markets and all the rest of it, and which issues of consumption and consumerism and those are all involved. But no, we have to reinterpret it in terms of the falling rate of profit. I would like to suggest that any theory of crisis of this system, and this is the point of seeing it as a totality, you can find the location of crisis within the dynamic of this system and point to a point of origin. But you know perfectly well that if one part fails, then the whole system can be stopped, or if one part is in trouble, there's going to be a lot of trouble elsewhere within the system. So the point of having an analysis of the totality is precisely to be able to start to think about the way in which a problem in one area will go into another. Now, how does this relate to the way in which Marx structures his investigations in the Grundrisse? Interestingly, all of that stuff from the beginning about money, Marx kind of is arguing with the Proudhonists, and he's getting into all kinds of things about, you know, can you change what's going on in this monetary field in such a way as to somehow or other change the dynamic of the system? And the answer is no, but as he gets towards the end of the monetary section, he starts to say, well, actually, the circulation of money is a really critical feature of any capitalist system. And therefore, we have to really look very carefully at the nature of the circulation process and what the circulation process is doing. Well, it's partly circulating commodities. And so he spends a lot of time talking about the circulatory form of money in relationship to commodity exchange. Money also does something else, which is by setting up a price structure, it allows information to be conformed. So the information function becomes important. So the price side of it becomes very significant. But if we're just interested in prices and we're just interested in circulation of commodities, as he points out, anything would do. You know, you wouldn't care about, you know, money at all. Because fake money, he says, is just as good for any of those functions as anything else. And then he kind of says, well, but actually money is also a store of wealth. And when it starts to function as a store of wealth, it becomes important. And then, of course, you get the final thing of money, which is used as capital. Okay, now, money which is used as capital changes the whole dynamic of what is going on. Money which is being used as capital is a radical departure in the circulation of money. So out of the circulation of money in general comes a very specific form of circulation, which is the circulation of money as money capital. And money capital is going to work in such a way as to create more money capital. So that then means that capital itself takes on money and takes on value. Now, here we have something which is important also, which I've been evading up until now, which is, what is this thing called value? Capital, Marx says, is value in motion. What is value? Value is not material. Value is immaterial. And Marx is not a natural history materialist. He's a historical materialist, and he deals with immaterial elements. So many of Marx's basic categories are in fact immaterial. Money is, and value is immaterial. it has a material representation. Money is the material representation of value. Value is something that circulates, and it is a social relation. But it circulates in such a way as to reproduce itself, and it's reproducing the capital relation. And it is capitalists who circulate the money in such a way as to actually, in a recurrent way, rebuild the basis of their own reproduction. So value is something which is connected to the reproduction of the class relation between capital and labor and the reproduction of the capitalist class. So again, this is a circulation process which has a particular objective and changes its meaning when its objective changes. So money, when it's just circulating commodities and there's no accumulation going on, but money, when it becomes capital, is about accumulation, and it's about the reproduction of the capitalist class and the capitalist class power, and it comes along with a certain definition of wealth. Now, several people raised the kind of question, what is wealth? Well, the answer there is that, it's not Marx giving an answer. He's giving us an answer saying what capital defines as wealth is money, power, and command over assets. And that's it. And when later on he kind of says, wouldn't it be better to think of wealth as being disposable time? He's kind of saying, look, the capitalists have a definition of wealth, and it's not a good definition of wealth, and it's not a conducive one to lots of free time and the like. So Marx is kind of saying that the definition of wealth in a capitalist society changes from the way in which wealth might have been set up or understood back in sort of feudal times, and then this then leads to the Marx talking in very sort of direct ways about the production of wealth and how the capitalist class is about self-reproduction by the reproduction of value through production. And yes, it is through production, but it has to command also all the moments of realization, so that it has to play this very important role of setting up wants, needs, and desires, so that in order to so when you kind of say, how does it have to orchestrate all of these different moments within the system so that it works in such a way that they come out of it better off at the end of the day than they were at the beginning of the day, and they preserve their own capitalist class power. That is a circulation process of a very, very distinctive sort, and that is what comes out of the circulation of money. So the analysis of the circulation of money, I think, Marx is set up, is a very interesting point. And when he kind of says the monetary side of things is the first form of circulation which we have to look at, he's talking about, okay, how did this happen historically? And of course, there's a lot of stuff historically about how money destroyed the community by creating the community. And of course, it destroyed certain ideas about wealth by creating new ones. So the question of what is wealth is, okay, not for Marx a question of what he would like it to be or what you or I like it to be. It's really a question of what it is that the capitalist society is going to define as wealth. And we know very much what that is. And when we kind of say, okay, there's a different way in which we can talk about wealth and well-being and all this kind of thing, we get a rather nasty jolt. For instance, the World Bank at a certain point decided that these World Bank annual reports on the state of the economy, which is all about, GDP and flows and all the rest of it, was not really adequate. So in the 1990s, they had a whole kind of thing where they started to talk about the UN Development Report instead of the World Bank report. And the Development Report looked at all kinds of social measures, suicides and infant mortality and happiness indexes and things of that kind. And so for a few years, they produced a development report. And of course, what happened? Guess what? The United States didn't come out number one on the development report. And since the United States owns the World Bank, at a certain point they discontinued doing the development reports because it didn't shed a good light on what the United States was doing. And it was seen as an anti-US kind of plot by the rest of the world to sort of come up with a development indices that didn't look good from the standpoint of the United States. Now, so this is, if you like, now, actually what Marx does in the Grundrisse is to talk about different circulation processes. And the first one is the monetary circulation, which he deals with at length and then says the monetary circulation gets organized in a certain way within this totality to perform a certain function, which is what he calls the MCM function, that is money being used to buy commodities to make money, which more money. So MCM, as opposed to a CMC, which is commodities used, where people use money to just change commodities, in which case you don't have to have an increment in that because you get an exchange of use values. So CMC is a very different circulatory process than MCM. Now, Marx then looks at this small circulation that I talked about, which is what kind of circulation process is the working class in? They're in a different circuit. They are in a CMC circuit. They start with a commodity, labor power. They get money for it, and then they use that money to buy things in order to reproduce themselves and in such a way as to come back into the workforce next morning. So they're in a CMC circuit. Now, CMC circuit, the logic of it is an exchange of use values. I have a use value, I can labor, but I can't eat my labor. I need food. So I give you my labor, and then you give me the money, and I will go get my food. And so the bargain that the wage laborer has, which is embedded in this process that we talked about, there's a circulation process which is about the reproduction of labor power. Marx mentions this, a small circulation, and there are several passages where he talks about, well, actually when the laborer gets round to, with the wages, they're no longer a worker, they're simply a buyer. And they're going to approach the whole kind of question of what happens in the world of realization. But they play an important role in realization. And there's a kind of comment that several people picked up on, kind of saying, every capitalist represses the wages of their own workforce, but at the same time hopes that other capitalists will give big wages to their workers so that they then form a market. So the whole kind of question of working class consumption, what is the value of labor power? Now, what are workers actually going to be concerned about within that circulation process? They're not accumulating anything by being in production. They're not actually, they don't have any incentive even to accumulate anything. What they do have is a great interest in their standard of living. That is, can they raise their wages in some way so that they have more? So the whole kind of question of what the value of labor power is and what the value is of the commodities which they need to reproduce, that becomes very significant. So there's this mini circuit within this overall circuit, which is the circuit of the small circuit, which is the circuit of the reproduction of labor power. And it has a dual character. First off, the qualities of the labor power which are brought to market are very significant. And so, if you like, this circuit touches upon the general circulation process at the point, of course, where they go in, the workers go into the labor process. It also touches at the point where the workers have the money and they start spending the money on goods and services. So that circulation process latches into the rest of the circulation processes. And of course, working class consumption is a very, very big thing. And if working class consumption is cut down in some way, it does all kinds of hell in production. I mean, we see with this virus, working class consumption has been sort of cut because we've got mass unemployment. We've got, 40 million unemployed or something of that kind, and they don't have the consumer capacity. There is a real realization problem. The airlines are not going to realize any value because nobody's flying off on vacations to the Bahamas. We've got, there's a blockage in this system right now, which has a lot to do with the fact that working class consumption is being cut. And that is meaning that the capacity of realization is being cut. So you have that. The centerpiece of what Grundrisse are about is, of course, the relationship between fixed capital circulation and circulating capital. That is two different circulating processes. And we know that they relate to each other. I mean, fixed capital comes out of circulating capital, and fixed capital supports circulating capital. But then circulating capital, if fixed capital is going to retire its value, is going to have to attach a lot of circulating capital. I mean, if you build an airport and there's no flights coming, then it's dead capital. It's devalued capital in the circuit. Now, the reason why the fixed capital and the circulating capital becomes so significant is because we're dealing there with long-term investment in the built environment, and we're dealing with the reproduction of labor the built environment, and we're dealing with all of those kinds of things. And it's a different circulatory process. It has different rules of engagement, and therefore, a bit like the human body has these different circulatory systems. So the totality has circulating capital, it has fixed capital, it has the small capital, it has the monetary circulation, and it also, Marx hints, he doesn't go into it in very great detail, there are other circulatory processes which are here. For example, there is interest-bearing capital. And Marx is very clear that interest-bearing capital has its own rules of circulating. And of course, there, the social relation, which is crucial, is between debtors and creditors, which is not the same as the class relation between capital and labor. And even the laborer, when they're in the market, is in a buyer-seller relation, and so you get completely different structures of social relations within these different circuits. And these different circuits are all interlocked and moving together. And of course, they compensate for each other. One of my arguments I've often made is that when there's an overproduction or real problems of realization of value in the circulating capital, one of the things capital does is to go off and build in the built environment. And a vast amount of money then is sort of siphoned off from the circulating circuit to the fixed capital circuit, which in effect is how China got out of the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, was by a massive flow of capital flowing into fixed capital formation, building new cities, building railroads, building dams, building highways, building all kinds of things of this sort. So there was a huge flow. So the relationship between these different circulation processes becomes very significant. But at the same time, what that means is that you can get crises emerging in any one of these circulatory processes, and any one of them, if it gets blocked or caught up or something in any kind of way, any one of them can actually then throw a spanner in the total circulation process and force major adjustments. The whole reproduction of labor power is a fraught kind of question. What kind of labor power do we want? This is an issue that's raised up again and again. I mean, if fixed capital is doing what it's doing, and it's actually turning most of the workforce into kind of, just machine minders or service workers, as opposed to actually making anything. If that is the case, then what kind of process of social reproduction of labor power should there be, and how should the reproduction of labor power be constructed? And if most of these people are going to be unemployed, then how are you going to maintain the effective demand unless it's going to be by universal basic income and things like that? And by the way, several people kind of suggested I might think universal basic income is a good idea. My answer to that is it might be a short-term thing, actually, right now. It might as an emergency measure, but in the long run, it will never work for the very simple reason that if you change the purchasing power capacity of the working class and you don't control prices of pharmaceutical products and all the rest of it, then you're not going to go anywhere. I mean, the working class are not going to improve their standard of living. In fact, they may get it even worse because they've got a higher minimum wage or universal basic income or something of that kind. And by donating, as it were, universal basic income, you also forego what labor in itself might do if it started to organize and take over the means of production. In other words, this is a favorite trick of socialist thinking about this circulation process, which is you can deal with the distributional side of things, and by intervening with distribution, you can somehow or other solve the major problems of the system. But I think the analysis of the system would teach you that you can't do that, and that therefore, Michael Roberts and everybody else is right when they kind of say, look, you're not going to go anywhere until you get hold of production. And to get hold of production means to actually get hold of the production of surplus value, which means to get hold of the production and reproduction of the capitalist class, which means actually the abolition of the class privilege of the capitalist class. And that's one of the reasons why nobody wants to go to this kind of realm of production, is precisely because that's what is entailed. But one other point that Marx made when he dealt with the circulation of interest-bearing capital, he said, you like to think that maybe interest-bearing capital came out of nowhere. And of course, there's a long history of it, debt, and credit, and all this kind of stuff. But Marx kind of says, actually, one of the raison d'etres of the circulation of interest-bearing capital is the existence of fixed capital. And the financing of fixed capital formation is critically connected to financial institutions and financial services, and therefore the financial sector becomes absolutely embedded. So look, we've got circulation of money, we've got the circulating capital, we've got the small circulation, we've got the circulation of fixed capital, we've got the circulation of interest-bearing capital. We've got 5 different circulatory systems within the totality. And that isn't the end of the story, because there are more elements within this. For instance, what about merchant capital? Does merchant capital have its own kind of circuit? The answer is yes, it does. And so again, merchant capital becomes significant. And what we've seen actually over the last 20 or 30 years is a domination of a lot of merchant capital over production capital. The merchants have, if you like, what's sometimes called monopsony power, because the textile factories and all the rest of it are making stuff, and they get very low wages, and it's the Gap and all those other companies, and Benetton or whatever, who gets the benefit. And you look at Apple computers and so on, basically made in Shenzhen, but the Apple, which is really a merchant capitalist with some other things going on, of course, in terms of design and all the rest of it. So merchant capital has its own role to play. So, and then of course, there's landed capital. Now, landed capital is a thorn in the side of a lot of this. Marx actually at a certain point kind of said, well, you can treat the land as just a form of fixed capital. Well, you can't in the long run. I mean, for his purposes at that moment of the analysis, it might be a reasonable thing to have done, but on the other hand, there's no way that's going to wash for very long. But the kind of question of to what degree is land, and it comes into the other question, which is to what degree does control over assets start to be significant, and what are the asset values and how are asset values being determined? So there are all these different circuits. So what I would like to suggest to you is that the reading of the Grundrisse should really anchor around it as an exploration of these different circulatory systems which exist within the totality. And in the same way that the circulatory systems in the human body interact and interweave, and at the same time provide us with an understanding of certain sites where certain things can go wrong. So what we see in this, so that 2007, 2008 was a crisis which began in housing markets. Now, what are housing markets? It's not fixed capital. Well, it is in some respects, but basically it's what Marx calls a consumption fund, which is the parallel on the consumption side with fixed capital. That is the funding of the consumption fund. And the mortgage debt in the United States became huge. Now, in Marx's time, there was no such thing as mortgage debt. He didn't have to deal with it. But what we find is the form of circulation has grown and become inserted into the totality in such a way as to actually, at some point, be a disruptive force and create a crisis. Now, I think this is so you look at that crisis and you say it's a crisis of that system, which has ramifications for everybody else. And so this then becomes a way of starting to create analyses. Now, I know I'm going on a bit, but I want to go on to just one last point, which is critical for the moment. One of the things that I had in this thing is something up here which is called free gifts of human nature and culture, and production and destruction of human nature and culture. There's a whole kind of cultural background to this. And here we have production, reproduction, and destruction of space and nature. This process we're looking at is embedded in a social... Hello. Something happened.
I think you're fine, Professor. We see you.
You do? Oh, okay. I don't see anything at all.
We'll figure out a way to reconnect. Please just hold on.
Okay. All right. So, what I've basically been saying here is that I think this is a very interesting way to start to try to understand an economy. And I read the Grundrisse this time as an essay on how to understand the economy from the standpoint of a totality, with many different circulatory systems at work within it. And it's a very complicated kind of question. But then, if you think about the analogy of the human body is pretty complicated, but we spend time trying to figure out what's going on. And I think the difference between Marx's analysis, which is pushing in this kind of way. And conventional economics is, I think, very, very significant, because I think this is a much richer way of pursuing it, for a variety of reasons. And I think that the whole kind of question of the relation to nature is taken up a bit in the Grundrisse. And I think that what we're in right now is not only a kind of a crisis of a cultural crisis, but we're in a whole series of crises which are about the way in which this system is embedded within the environment, and what its relation is with the environment, and how we should think about the environmental questions. And of course, we have the pandemic, but lurking behind that is the whole kind of question of climate change. And here too, there's a way, it seems to me, with starting from that diagram and then recognizing that actually it's only a schematic surface representation of a much more complicated thing, that we can then start to think about more clearly about the relationship between the question of nature, the destruction of certain natural features, and how we might try to orchestrate the flow of value within that whole system in such a way as to be more benign in terms of its offshoots in relationship to nature and to culture. Now, I often find myself somewhat criticized because I tend to draw attention to Marx's phraseology in the Grundrisse, where he talks about the free gifts of nature and the free gifts of human culture. Now, I don't think that these should be thought of as free gifts in the sense that they can be used any way you want. But I think Marx's point is that actually, to the degree that capital does not have to take any cognizance of the environmental effects that may come from that circulatory process, it treats nature as in terms of free gifts. And there's a language in Marx's own thinking here in the Grundrisse, which is a little bit disturbing sometimes, because it sounds like he's really talking about the domination of nature, which of course many people would now regard as a very bad thing. But being locked down here with a virus around, I actually would like a little domination of nature. And in fact, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to orchestrate everything possible to dominate this particular virus. And we've done the same. And I think one of humanity's big achievements for itself was the elimination of smallpox and so on. So if you take this whole kind of process that's going on in the Grundrisse in this relational way, in terms of relationalities and of different circulatory processes operating within the totality, you start to have an idea about how to think about the economy with a different perspective than the sort of rather mechanical way in which conventional economics looks at it, or conventional sociology tends to look at it. It's a much richer way, and of course it's a motion geared way. And so what I get out of it this time is, as I said, is more of a kind of a notion that to think of the different circulatory processes which are embedded within the totality of a capitalist system. So, okay, I'm going to stop at this point and try and get you to sort of talk a little bit about some of your reactions. I have, like I say, I've got some particular issues that I think I've covered some of them in what I'm saying, but let's see what we can find. Oh, okay, I see people coming up. Okay.
Just an announcement, we're going to enable everyone's microphones, so please just jump in when you have a comment.
Okay, let me see some of the Yeah, okay. Jeanette? I'm not
No.
hearing anything.
Mhm.
Jeanette, can you talk? I can't hear you.
It might have just been an unmute by mistake. Maybe it would be good to see if anyone.
Everybody seems to be muted.
People can unmute themselves when they'd like to speak.
Okay.
If anyone has any technical difficulties, just send a message on the chat.
I'm not getting anything.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi, I'll get us started. Well, first, just thanks so much for this course. This was, I think, the regular practice in the past couple months has been a real lifeline. So I'm really grateful, and I'm sure many other people are as well. So I
Well,
wanted to
thank you.
ask, yeah, thank you. I wanted to ask one. I mean, there's many things I'd like to ask. I'll just to start us off, you know, the point you were raising about the attention to the different circuits and the attentiveness to where the crisis breaks out, where where there are blocks in circulation, and the realization of capital. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Maybe if we use 2008 and the current crisis as models, or to speak more broadly, lessons you can take from Marx about how we take that information in order to understand opportunities for working class organization and working class struggle. I don't know if that's a clear question.
Well, yeah, well, there are two parts to that. One is, you know, if there's a crisis in the financial system, for example, and what we'll often find in that is that the crisis in the financial system is partly sort of for technical reasons. There will be blockages within the system. There's not enough liquidity, or the liquidity is being cut, or something of that kind. So you can get a crisis which to some degree can be manufactured by one faction of capital to engage in predatory practices against another. For instance, I think the crisis in East and Southeast Asia in 1997-98 was a crisis which was manufactured by financial institutions to cut the liquidity, so that many firms in the production sector had to go out of business, and then they could be bought up by financial institutions, and when things recovered, they could be sold back at a huge profit. So this was a manipulation, if you like, which was occurring within that sphere. And of course, the collateral damage was that a lot of working people got unemployed, because if a firm went bankrupt, they had to lay off their workers, and that then kind of so So, but in a sense, it was not a direct attack upon the working class. It had the working population was a collateral damage of the situation. So this sort of thing is often happening within the capitalist system, and the idea that all of the fights are going to be between capital and labor. Well, if you look at some of the fights going on over the opioid epidemics and the role of big pharma in extracting vast amounts of money from a victimized population, you know, this is not your classic capital versus labor struggle. So one of the things that comes out of this is that each one of these circuits has a very particular kind of class configuration and social configuration. And that would mean that we can't cram all of it into a traditional kind of view of, you know, workers versus capitalist corporations. And so that's why I tend to want to talk about the broad panoply of anti-capitalist struggle, because I think the struggle over what's going on with the, you know, pharmaceuticals and big pharma and all of that in the country, all of that is a significant form of anti-capitalist struggle, but it doesn't call forth, you know, a trade union and a sort of a socialist form of organizing. It's likely to do something else. Now, right now, we have a situation where we've got the virus, which is a kind of it's a very specific, but again, who's the collateral damage in all of this? And I think it has a class content, but it's not the traditional class content. And who is the enemy? Well, the enemy is the virus, but at the same time, it's also the capitalist class that's organized the capitalist state in such a way that it cannot deliver decent security to the mass of the population. So there's a different social component to the anti-capitalist struggle in that case. So I would want to look as far as possible at the general field of anti-capitalist struggle and to say, look, the struggles that are going on around you know, the exploitation of Amazon workers right now, and the struggles that are going on over rental extractions, so that we're beginning to see the kind of the emergence of rent strikes and things of that kind. All of this is in the field of anti-capitalist struggle, and we should want to organize and think about it. But we have to think about it in terms of where it's located within the totality that we're looking at, in order to establish what our alliances might be with people who are struggling elsewhere within the system. My own sense of things was I was always, you know, before this virus struck, it seemed to me that the whole kind of structure of capitalist money making was extremely fragile and could easily be broken. And so it didn't surprise me at all when the virus came. But the virus, of course, is it's not exactly an external invader, because the origins of the virus are almost certainly caught up with environmental transformations, and which are partly due to capitalist reorganization of the interior space of much of East and Southeast Asia, where it seems that several of these viruses are coming from these kinds. But if you know that, then you obviously have to organize society to protect against them. So my feeling is that you know, we need to think about the general field of anti-capitalist struggle, and to recognize that all of us are connected in one way or other to different parts of this struggle, and it's all those different parts which need, with of course right now a particular part which is right at the center of the difficulties. Anybody else want to chip in? Ms. Three?
Hi. Thank you for these classes. This is really like, it was such an important part of my life these past 2 months. And I was thinking about your, in one of the classes you had asked the question, what is the, is capital a civilizational force? What is the civilizational force of, or civilizing force of capital? And I was thinking whether we should think about that in this context, in the context of COVID-19, and the very fact that that something that is external to the market can stop the economy. Isn't it? Doesn't it have some consequence to that question?
Yeah, no, it has a huge consequence, but it's interesting that on the one hand, you can say it is external to the market, but it's not external to the totality of the system.
Right.
And there is, of course, a strong debate going on as to exactly how to understand these non-market aspects of social and biological configurations, and how to think about management of them. And this is a difficult question, because when you say management of them, a lot of people will kind of say, well, the issue, for instance, over the environmental, I mean, the language on environmental and nature in the Grundrisse, and it is interesting to go back and just look at it from that perspective. But that language is rather problematic. It really does often emphasize ideas of domination of nature and so on. But like I said, there are some aspects of domination of nature that right now I don't think are a bad idea at all. And actually, I think if we run away from that, then we're likely to run into all kinds of problems. At some point or other, we have to be able to control viruses and be able to mobilize science and technology in such a way as to be able to live with them, and at a certain point, so how elements like that and how processes of that sort can be integrated into the understanding of capitalist society as a whole, and the transition to a socialist society, and what that might look like, and how a socialist society might deal with questions of public health and the like. I mean, right now it's pretty clear that 40 years of neoliberalism have destroyed the capacity of states and so on to really guard against these sorts of things. And I suspect that we're going to come out of this with a strong sentiment on the part of many populations that we have to reoccupy the state and get the state to actually do some, do the kind of work that needs to be done to protect us. I mean, this seems to me to be the thrust of some of the things that are beginning to be said by the political class in this country. But there is, I think, again, there's this very narrow conception of capital, which is it's just about limited by market exchange. But it seems to me the broader conception of capitalism is something that needs to be, we really need to think about much more clearly.
Thank you.
So who else is out there? I got some, I have some comments from Tenjo. You want to come and talk?
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
Thank you very much for this class, and I really appreciate just hanging out with you on Tuesday and listening to your lecture. And I guess something that's been really one of the comments that I sent to you is something on the consumption habits. I think something that really caught my attention throughout your lectures has always been around when you're just like in brief moments, we'll talk about consumption habits and we need to think about consumption time being shortened. And yeah, so I'm just really curious now that, yeah, it's just bugging me in a way that I don't quite understand how to work through yet. So I just kind of asked that in a way, as a way to maybe rethink what we can do or think about in this COVID-19 situation.
Well, I think, capital colonizes certain areas of production. And over the last 20 years, and particularly over the last 10 years, it's really gone big time into systems of production where the consumption time is close to zero. And in other words, what capital is selling is not so much a thing as an experience. And that's what tourism is all about. And my favorite, I often mention that the number of tourist visits rose from something like 800 million to 1.4 billion in 10 years. And all of that took, of course, airlines and all the rest of it. Now that's all crashed. Mm-hmm. And I think it's interesting that most of the instantaneous unemployment has been in the hospitality industries and in what you might call the spectacle, the production of spectacle, with the exception of those things which are closed. And I use the Netflix example and those sorts of things. I mean, the subscriptions to Netflix when this whole thing hit went through the roof, apparently.
Right.
But now people get socialized into very fast turnover times of everything, and there is a sense in which if that is what Andre Gortz called compensatory consumerism, that it doesn't really work very well, and it is, I think, going to be fascinating to see to what degree people realize that they have been trapped in this cultural thing of chasing one experience after another experience and hoping somehow or other they're going to be happy and get satisfaction out of it. And right now, being locked down, you kind of realize you can't do all of those things. And I'm used to traveling around the world and flying airlines and that kind of stuff, and I haven't been doing that for a while. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know, would I really want to go back to doing all of that? Mm-hmm. When this is all over, so I think that this is a moment of where we can actually see that a culture that has been constructed largely under the pressure of capitalist accumulation in fields where there's an instantaneous forms of consumption, capital accumulation of that sort may be less possible because the cultural configuration that had been constructed to support it has taken a severe knock, and it's not clear that the cultural configuration will actually be reestablished. I mean, I will be interesting to see, how fast people go back to doing everything they were doing before, and whether they kind of go, well, no, I realize that somehow or other I was being super exploited at the point of consumption by consumerism that was not satisfying at all, and was really featured by the perpetual stressful search for consumer happiness and conforming to some of the ads which you see on TV. I mean, I don't know if anybody's going to go on a cruise liner for a while, for example. So I think there's going to be some barriers there. But I think also, even beyond that, I think there's going to be there could be some be some cultural shifts which are not going to be easily reversed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something I guess I'm also curious about is just there is a both highlighting the sense of infrastructure, right, or like
Yeah.
population that supports this sort of consumption habits that we're having, but at the same time, the increasing virtualization of all of our consumption practice, including this class, for example, alongside Netflix, alongside sort of like takeout or food delivery services, and it. Yeah, I guess I'm just curious also just like at what point do these two forms sort of like communicate with each other, or is there, or does it look like it's a separation between both acknowledging frontline workers or delivery workers or the infrastructure that supports them, but then at the same time yearning for a instantaneous form of consumption patterns? And so like right now at the moment, I don't really, maybe it's just not being able to go out, or but it feels to me two separate sort of forces, and but two parts of the same problem.
Yeah, no, I don't know how, I really have, I haven't a crystal ball to say what would happen. I do know several people who, for example, have been realizing that they quite enjoy cooking. and food, I mean, for much of my life, I would always cook at home, and it's only just recently that I've taken to eating out more and more, and even taking takeout. And now I kind of going, I don't know, I think it's quite fun to get back and cook some things. And so, if people get pleasure, as much pleasure out of cooking as they do out of other things, then they may just go back to doing that. And in which case, there's not going to be the business there for the restaurants. And, I mean, it's again, these are cultural shifts, and how deep they may go and how far they will spread, who knows? I mean, it's a very uncertain situation. I just do have a feeling that there are going to be some long-term shifts, and who knows exactly what they are.
Right. Thank you, Professor.
Who else can I call on?
Hi, Professor. I just wanted to share one of my takeaways from the course that I really appreciated. I found your discussion today and throughout the semester of the way Marx talks about the domination of nature very interesting. And I also find it a nice kind of adjunct of the way that he talks about the nature of capital.
Yeah.
And I really just think I learned a lot through reading this and thinking about it with you this semester on that second part of the nature of capital as it relates to the domination of nature, and the ways in which capital will have to find new ways to use nature, and will have to find use in forms of nature that it didn't use before. I'm just finding that really productive to think with, so I wanted to thank you.
Okay, no, I think that's a very interesting. We didn't really highlight that too much in the Grundrisse, but it's if you ever get back to reading through it again, it's a good idea to kind of watch out for those passages where Marx, it's very often a throwaway sentence here or there, and try and pin it together to see what his perspective really is. Okay, how about me calling on somebody then? Corinne Blaylock, you want to come on?
I do have a question, but I stepped away from my computer, so let me come right back.
Okay.
But maybe call on someone in the meantime.
Okay. Okay, how about Colleen Chevron? No? Anybody else?
So I have one question that came up for me sort of, I've loved the class, and this has been a sort of, as everyone, echoing everyone who said that it's been a really sort of amazing constant over the last few months. But one thing I've been really taken with is the idea of trying to think, I think the way I originally learned Marx was really this emphasis on production. And alongside this, I've been reading a lot of feminist theory, looking at social reproduction.
Yeah.
And I was interested in the way in which, if we take the emphasis and like how that fits into your paradigm, and because oftentimes we talked about sort of what I would sort of understand as social reproduction in terms of consumption. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you see social reproduction sort of fitting into all of this if we sort of de-emphasize the production aspect.
Well, I think one of the things I always try to emphasize when I think about any one of these moments is that each one of these moments is what Marx, the language he uses is it's autonomous and independent, but subsumed within the overall logic of the totality. And I think the social reproduction, this is a very good way to think of it. I mean, a lot of things are going on in terms of social reproduction, which are not determined by, what's going on in production or consumerism or anything else. So there's a lot of independent transformations going on in social reproduction, which, of course, some of which is around questions of redefinition of gender roles and definitions of sexuality and all the rest of it. But at the same time, while all of that's going on, the household is still a primary point of consumption, and people learn their consumer habits very much from being embedded in the household. And now nobody sits down and says, okay, I'm going to train my kids how to consume. But in practice, a lot of what goes on in the household is about kids being socialized into being good consumers. And the kids themselves have something to say about this. I mean, they want toys for Christmas and they want all this sort of thing. But capital is very cognizant of this and is really trying to, get the kids at a very early age to be wonderful little consumers, and they are a very important consumer force in society. I'm just using the kids because and women too, but also, of course, the household is a site of education into induction into the labor force. And I think that this means the stuff about you're not only educating people to be consumers, you're also educating them to be producers. And then the question arises, what kind of producers are they going to be? And I was always very sort of taken with some of the literature about how hidden class configurations were built in at a very early age through structures and processes of social reproduction, because we're not only dealing with households, we're also dealing with educational institutions, and we're dealing with neighborhood configurations of understanding and peer group pressures and all the rest of it. So I think that certainly the social reproduction is a very vibrant sphere of investigation right now, and some very, very good literature coming out in this area, which acknowledges that the social reproduction is embedded in the overall structure, but at the same time is kind of saying, well, what's happening in social reproduction is also transforming throughout the whole structure, because you can't transform all of the household relations without transforming some of the practices of realization, some of the practices of distribution, and the like. So, I mean, this is a fantastic area of inquiry now, and like I say, there's a lot of very good literature on how to understand the theories of social reproduction. Now, there's a lot of controversy, and which is healthy. And of course, in my little diagram, one of the things I do is to kind of say, well, this also involves a lot of cultural features which are coming out of the cultural structures which exist in contemporary societies, and how those cultures are drawn upon and utilized in certain ways. So the sphere of social reproduction is, I think, a fascinating one to look at right now. And like I say, there's some fantastic literature on it, which I found great to read and look at. Have you worked on this some?
Oh, me?
Yes.
Yeah, so I'm something I've read a lot, but we're trying to put together something right now on law, political economy, and social reproduction. And so it's been sort of ever present in trying to think through sort of how these literatures fit together, and how we might sort of not always treat them separately, but actually put them in dialogue with one another.
Yeah, no, that's great if you can do that. I mean, yeah. Well, good luck with that. I mean, I think it's, so you said law and as well?
Law and political economy. Yeah. We're trying to think them together. Law has not really wrestled with many of these issues over the years at all. And so we're trying to figure out how we might add that back in as well.
Yeah, great. It's fantastic. I'd love to see what you do.
Yeah, I'm happy to share.
Okay, who else wants to talk? Laura Rivas, you want to talk?
Hi, Professor Harvey. First, I'll echo the feeling of my colleagues and thank you for a wonderful course. I've really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. And the thing that stuck with me, although I'm sure there's probably much that I still don't grasp as well, but the thing that stuck with me was our conversation about the circulation of fixed capital, specifically the enigma behind the validity of the value theory with the increase of social and technical knowledge that leads to investing in fixed over variable capital. It left me thinking about how to increase wealth and that idea as that idea of disposable time without expanding the industrial reserve army. That is like, how can labor organize against it if the very disruption of the organic composition of capital in such a way disempowers the position of the worker and renders them even more disposable within the power dynamics of capital? I know that there were also some sections in which that might have been where Marx maybe goes against that. And I remember you redirected us to a quote that I think when we were discussing that I think it was, I wrote it in my reflection, but I don't have it in front of me, but in the earlier part of the book where that shift might be accompanied also by.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's the equalization of the rate of profit, which leads to transfers of value from labor-intensive to capital-intensive sectors.
Right, and how there are sectors then that sort of subsidize the ones that become less dependable on labor.
Yeah, see, I mean, look, I don't know how to parse this properly. I mean, it's not as if I have some key insight that unlocks it. But one of the things that occurred to me, because several people raised this in writing questions, one of the things that occurred to me was this, that if the value theory is destroyed by all of this investment in science and technology embedded in fixed capital, if that's the case, then actually you've destroyed the basis of capitalist class power. Because it's not only have you destroyed the value theory, but who produces the value is the worker, but who appropriates it is capital. And if there's no value, then the reproduction of the capitalist class is threatened. Okay. Now, if that's the case, then it would say that at the same time as capital is going to be pouring money into fixed capital formation and then science and technology and all the rest of it, it's going to be desperate to find other ways to reproduce class power. And this is where one of those things that comes up in the section on the falling rate of profit becomes significant, because Marx then kind of says, well, this can be counteracted by the development of new sectors of production which are labor intensive. And then you kind of say to yourself, well, okay, capital is investing in the fixed capital and all of this, and it's automating and it's doing all these kinds of things, and it's doing that in the auto industry. But at the same time, it's investing like crazy in tourism, which is labor intensive. All right. So in fact, one of the things it's going to be doing all of the time that it's on the one hand pursuing this kind of stuff with fixed capital, it's also going to be cultivating all sorts of sectors which are labor intensive, because it needs that in order to reproduce its power. And of course, its power is partly located in these high-tech sectors, because that's where all of the appropriation can go on. And that appropriation which goes on there is going to be subsidized by all of this other stuff, which is I don't know, restaurant workers. There are, I don't know, 20 million restaurant workers in this country. And that, again, is connected to this cultural shift of eating out and eating around, you know. So it would seem to me that when you start to think about capital flow and say, where do capitalists invest? Well, they invest in the high-tech stuff, but they're also going to invest in the hospitality industries and the like, which, as I say, are labor intensive. And it's going to want to have low-wage labor there, because also there is this amusing thing which several people have also commented on, that every capitalist wants their labor to live on the minimum wage at the same time as they hope that their competitors will pay maximum wage to provide a market for their commodities. So if you look on that discussion which Marx launches about the impact upon the value theory of the circulation of fixed capital with science and technology, if you look on that as somehow or other embedded in the whole system and systemically at the same time leading to a compensatory movement to explore labor-intensive sectors and to build labor-intensive sectors as the place where a lot of value can be created, very little will be appropriated, and a lot of transfer will go to the capital-intensive sectors, which maybe I should talk a little bit about how that happens. Marx's fable, if you want to call it that, is that each capitalist produces value according to the labor they employ. That value goes into a total pot of value worldwide. And then people draw upon that total pot of value according to the capital they advance, which means that the labor-intensive sectors are going to put much more value into the pot than they take out, and the capital-intensive will take a lot more out than they put in. So that's the sort of fiction that Marx builds and says, well, it's not as if any particular capitalist will get the value or the surplus value they produce. They don't get it at all. It just flows through the market system into this huge pot of global value and surplus value, which is then divided amongst the capitalists according to capital intensity rules. So that's how that system works. But when I read that this time, I noticed it says on the one hand, okay, this destroys labor as a basis, and it becomes a miserable, and you know, the value theory provides a miserable basis for the, so there's all of that sort of language. But then it says, but capital at the same time wants to preserve the value theory. And you kind of go, why do they want to, why does capitalists want to preserve the value theory? And the answer is, as I mentioned earlier, that the value theory is not really a theory of price. It's about a theory of the reproduction of the class power of capital. Which is why I don't like this idea that somehow or other the socialists should take over the value theory, because, you know. So anyway, but that's how I look at it this time. Like I say, probably next year I'll have a different interpretation of it, but I think that makes sort of sense to me right now.
Yeah, thank you, Professor. That was really helpful.
Okay, who else is? So how many people want to read the book again? Hugo.
Hey, David. Just wanted to say thank you. Your cactus is looking nice there. It's nice
Yeah,
to.
isn't it great? It comes from Oaxaca.
I was in Oaxaca when this crisis started. A pandemic escalated in March in the Americas.
Wow. Yeah. Well. Yeah. My son lives in Oaxaca, so.
Yeah, magical place.
Yeah, it is, absolutely.
But to answer your question, it was a tough read. I don't know if I'd like run to read it again. You know, I feel grateful to have your interpretation of it, you know, throughout.
Well, you know, I got something to say about that. The first time I read Capital, you know, to be honest, I didn't understand what the fuck was going on. And it was only the second time through that I really actually started to think it was interesting. And it was about the fourth or fifth time through that I really started to enjoy it. And I have to say that this is I don't know how many times, like I started out by saying I've been through the Grundrisse, but I really did enjoy it this time. It was really great fun for me to do, and it wasn't as if it was, you know, I really look forward to the sessions. I mean, I get a little kind of nervous about what the hell do I say about this and how do I say it, you know. But I actually find it and this is true of Capital too. That the more you kind of read it, but having got through it, I think that you might find it interesting to sort of take certain parts of it and sort of say, you know, that part was kind of interesting. I started to pick up, so I will read that bit again. And I think you could do that with the Grundrisse, and it's fun to just sort of open it up at a page, read a little bit, and think about, oh, what does that mean? And it's not, you know, it's really strange because in academia and elsewhere, Marx is depicted as such a dogmatic writer, and you kind of go, he's not dogmatic at all. He's constantly questioning things, opening things up, and then saying, oh, I don't think that's a good idea. Maybe I should do this instead. This wonderful moment in the Grundrisse where he says, oh, this whole thing is too Hegelian. I better do it all over again, get the Hegel out of it. So I think it does lend itself to kind of an open discussion and open reading, and in some ways I think Grundrisse is one of my favorite Marx books precisely because it does that. I mean, some of the other stuff is very rigorously set up. I mean, having said that, I do recognize that there are long passages in the Grundrisse which are, you know, as far as I'm concerned, incredibly boring and not exciting at all. So you've got to take the wheat with the chaff on that one.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate that. I think I will just follow those puzzle pieces, I guess, that stand out.
Yeah, and have fun with them, you know.
Yeah, and I feel that way. I'm like rereading the Tao Te Ching, and it's a little more sparse than the Grundrisse, but yeah, the first time I read it maybe a decade ago, I was just like, oh, I just like completely went over my head, you know, or I thought they were just poems, and I was like, these aren't as nice as Tanka poems or something, but yeah, now it's hitting. So
yeah, good.
Are you gonna give us a house tour or no? I'm just kidding. Just playing.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, I'm right beside the window here. It's a full moon tonight, just you know, and I have a beautiful full moon outside my window.
Ooh, beautiful.
Yeah. Okay, it seems to me like we're. Anybody else want any more comment? So, okay, maybe we should wind it up here, and I'll go off and do some cooking.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Well, thank you all, and I really appreciate the fact that you took this and took it seriously. And I hope you had some fun with it too.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for joining, and thank you for carrying on this class even as we've had to change with all the new conditions. And please stay tuned to other people's forum programming. We're going to keep going with many things. So thank you so much, Professor Harvey, and thank you to all the students and participants.
Okay, thank you.